Hi folks, in this video we're going to talk about a feature in QuickBooks Desktop called Condense. Now to access Condense, you click on the File menu, then onto Utilities, and then down to where it says Condense Data. Before we do a condense, I'm just going to click out of that for a second and maybe give you some background in terms of why or when you would be using this feature. So I'm going to hit Control-1 on my keyboard. That's going to open the product information or the company information window. And we're going to look at a couple of pieces of information that might be the cause, the underlying issue, where you might want to do a condense in your file. For example, this file size is 462,000 kilobytes, which means about 460 megabytes, which is a pretty big QuickBooks file. It's not huge, it's not unfathomable, but it is a pretty big file. So maybe you're trying to reduce the file size because maybe you're having some speed issues, some performance issues. The other reason why you might want to reduce is because your total targets are above 350,000. And if you're trying to convert your QuickBooks Desktop file to QuickBooks Online, one of the minimum requirements is that your total targets needs to be under 350,000. So this particular file, that would qualify because you got way too many transactions. And a target is every line item inside of a transaction, okay? So sometimes the targets, number of targets and the file size is similar, but sometimes it's just pure coincidence. Now on the right-hand side, we're gonna see how many accounts we have. So you notice we got 383 accounts. We have 16,000 names. So between customers, vendors, and employees, quite a bit of names. We have almost 3,000 items. So what ends up happening is, I'm gonna click OK, is that when you got a really big file size with a lot of customers, a lot of vendors, a lot of names, just having all that stuff becomes confusing. For example, I'm gonna run a profit and loss report for, let's say, the last 10 years. So I'm gonna go back to January 1st, 2010 through, let's say, 12/31, 2020. And then I'm gonna go up here in my profit and loss where it says show columns. I'm gonna select by year, and you're gonna notice that essentially I got 10 plus years of data in this QuickBooks file. And that's probably the reason why the file is so big. I got 10 years worth of data, a lot of potential transactions. So if you look at this profit and loss, and let's say I'm gonna try to print it, because of how big the profit and loss is, how much data there's in there, how many transactions are in there, a profit and loss in this case is 2 pages, way too many accounts. Some of them I'm probably not even using anymore. I've used it maybe a couple of years ago. There might be some opportunity to merge and clean up the chart of accounts, merge some accounts. That's a different story. But in general, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to reduce the file size by getting rid of a whole bunch of transactions. So before we do that, I'm just going to run a balance sheet real quick, just so you can see it. I'm going to run a balance sheet here as of 12/31, let's say 12/31/2019. So 12/31/2019. And let's say that my goal is to only have data for 2020 and 2021. Essentially, I want to get rid of all my 2019 data and older than that, but I want to keep this beginning balance sheet. So I'm going to use the balance sheet sort of as a starting point. I have it there. I'm probably going to save this as a PDF in my computer or something like that so I can compare it. But that's going to be my starting point. So January 1st, 2020 and on is the only data that I want to keep for the purposes of this, the context of this video. So let's go into Condense. I'm going to go to the File menu, go down into Utilities, and then go down to Condense. When I click on Condense, first it's going to ask me 2 questions. First, would you like to remove the audit trail? And removing the audit trail doesn't reduce the number of transactions. It doesn't get rid of any transaction data. What it gets rid of the history inside of each transaction. So without the audit trail, you won't know who created it, who modified it, that sort of thing. So if you're trying to just reduce the file size without getting rid of transactions, it tells you here more or less 28% of the file size will be removed, and that should improve the speed of the file overall, but it's not going to reduce number of transactions, number of years of data, or number of targets. So if that's what I'm trying to do, what I want to do is I want to remove transactions. So I do recommend removing the audit trail as a different process anyway. So let's click on remove the transactions and click on next. And then on the next screen, I get 3 choices. I get the first one, which is what we call the traditional condense, which is where we remove transactions before a specific date. So in this case, I would put 01/01/2020, because remember, everything up to 12/31/2019 I want to get rid of. There's a little checkbox here if you want to create a report of all the things that were removed. That's always good to do anyway. It takes a little longer, but that's fine. The second option is all transactions. That is if I want to get rid of all the data, all the transactions anyway, but I want to keep my chart of accounts, I want to keep my item list, that sort of thing. And then the last one, the third one, that's called a period copy. It's the same thing as the before a specific date. The difference is you're going to choose both a beginning date and an ending date. And what it does is it deletes everything behind that date and everything in front of that date. And the main difference between the first one, which is the traditional condense, and the period copy is that with the traditional condense, you will have a beginning balance sheet for 12/31/2019. But if I do a period copy, it will get rid of the balance sheet. So all my beginning balances go away as well. And there are reasons why you might want to choose one or the other. I'm going to post an article in the description where I specifically talk about the reasons why I use the period copy and what's my approach to creating period copies. In most cases, if someone wants to really reduce the file size and improve performance, they need to go with period copy, and they need to reconstruct all the beginning balances prior to that period copy. And again, I'm going to put a link in the description that can explains all those things. So I'm going to choose a traditional condense. We're going to pick 1/1/2020. Then we're going to click on next. Then the next question says, hey, there's a closing date password. You have to make sure that your closing date password is set up to a closing date after the date that we're doing. So I'm going to close that and I'm going to hit cancel. I'm going to click on the edit menu. I'm going to click on preferences. Then I'm going to go into accounting. I'm going to go into company preferences. And then I'm going to set up a closing date. And I'm going to date this 01/01/2020. That way I don't have a closing date password prior to where the condense is. And then I'm going to click OK. And the reason for that is because every time you delete or modify a transaction, the password will be prompted and it will be a mess for QuickBooks to try to automatically insert that password each time it's trying to get rid of one of those transactions. So we'll go back to that. We're going to pick the second option, remove the transactions from the company. We're going to pick the same option, transaction before a specific date, optional, create a report. Then we click on next. We should no longer have the error on the closing date password. Then it has the secondary question, which is only for companies that have inventory. So it says summarize inventory transactions recommended. That means it only removes some condensable inventory transactions and it keeps others. And this one that says keep inventory transaction details, that is going to keep every transaction that has inventory parts. I don't recommend the second one because it doesn't really reduce the file size greatly for companies that deal with inventory. So the first one is probably the best one, but there might be some issues on the inventory parts. We'll see that once we get the error log at the end. Then we're going to click on next. Then it's going to ask you the magic question, probably the most important question. You need to stop and think hard about this. It says, do you want to remove all of the following transactions? And here you're going to click yes, remove uncleared, unreconciled transactions, remove transactions marked to be printed, remove transactions to be sent, or at least the attributes in the transaction itself. So generally you want to select all these or maybe some of them depending on what you're trying to achieve. So in this case, let's say I want to, I'm going to uncheck all these, and let's say I want to remove all time and mileage. I want to remove unbilled expenses. I want to leave estimate sales orders and purchase orders. I'll leave that. I want to remove this, and also leave my uncleared bank transactions. There are reasons why you might want to do this or not want to do this. It all depends on what you're trying to achieve. Anything you modify and choose here might affect a beginning balance, and it might require you to do some additional work to get the beginning balance cleaned up. Generally, people would have all of the ones checked. That's the classical approach, but I'm going to uncheck these two just to show you there's some options that you have. Then I'm going to click on next, and then it says begin condense analysis, you're going to click on begin condense. And at this point, you're just going to wait. And it might take 10 minutes. It might take an hour. Depending on your file size, you're going to wait to see what the next screen is going to tell you. All right, so we got the analysis done. And there's basically a report that you can print with a list of transactions that cannot be removed. So there's a list of, in this case, like 10,000 transactions that cannot be removed. There's there's specific details around how this is going to be condensed or not. You can print that. You can keep that. Honestly, at the end of the day, not really a big deal in terms of the list of things. It's just letting you know that, hey, I can't remove everything, but for the most part, you will see it will remove quite a bit. So I can print this into a PDF or a printer, save that, and that gives me a general idea what those are. You can actually click in any of them and actually look at the underlying transaction if it matters. Most of the time, I ignore the code analysis. I mean, the condensed analysis. I print it, I keep it, but I don't need it long term. All right, so I went ahead and closed that. I went back to utilities, condensed data. Let's do that again. Let's go to next. Let's remove before transaction date. I'm going to get rid of these. I'm not going to hit the optional options. I don't want to create the report yet, or I don't need to create the report this time. Then I'm going to click on next. Then it's going to ask me, okay, how should we summarize the transaction? So we already did the report. We looked at it. We saved it. Now it's going to be in a different set of questions because we're ready to now move forward with the condense. So it says create one summary journal entry, create one for each month, or don't create a summary. So the don't create a summary kind of does a similar thing than the period copy. Most people don't do this. You could do the monthly journal entries. I guess you could keep that. Honestly, I want to make this file as small as possible and I don't need it. So I'm just going to do the one journal entry process. I'm going to click on next. Then it says, how should inventory be condensed? And we talked about this already. We're going to do the summarize. Then we're going to click on next. Then we're going to, we said we're going to uncheck this one and uncheck this one. Actually, no, not that one. It was this one. And then we're going to click on next. Then the next question, a new set of questions says, do you want to remove unused list entries? Probably more important than the previous question that I said that you have to pay attention to. This says, hey, now that I get rid of all the transactions prior to 1/1/2020, would you like for me to also to get rid of, delete accounts, customers, vendors, items, classes? You're going to get rid of everything that has not been used in the current period of transactions that has been left. So if there's an account or a customer or a vendor that were used prior to the condense, and I'm deleting all the transactions linked to that account, customer, or vendor, then by leaving them checked, it's going to remove them and only keep the ones that have been used during the current period. So I'm going to do that. Although, prior to this, what you can do is you can export the entire customer list, the entire vendor list, entire customer account list, item list. You can export all that stuff into Excel or IIF. And even if you delete it, you always have it in a file where you can bring them back or some of them back in the future. So this is always good to do. Reducing the file size and number of lists is really important as well. So we're going to click on next on that. And then it says, okay, we're going to begin to condense. This might take an hour. This might take a couple of hours. Go have some coffee or whatever. I'm going to go ahead and click on begin condense. And then we wait. All right, so that took like an hour with this file. And basically it says we have successfully removed all the transactions. Then I'm going to click on OK. Now I also went back and did the removal of the audit trail as well. So I basically hit the file up with both of those options, the traditional condense and the reduction of the audit trail, just so we can kind of see where we are at this point. So I'm going to hit Control-1 on my keyboard, get back to that product information. Now it tells me that my file size is 183 megabytes and my total targets are 261,000. So obviously there was a major reduction in both file size and number of transactions or number of targets. If we look at the number of customers, that has reduced. The number of accounts has reduced a little bit. If you go down here, the number of items, that's probably the biggest one. That was almost 3,000 on the other file or on the previous version of the file. So you see an immediate reduction of the file size. Now, what I'll also do is I'm going to run a report. I'm going to go to company financial, go to balance sheet, and I'm going to pull the exact same report I had pulled last time, 12/31/2019, and see that I do have beginning balances here. Now, I want to, at this point, I would probably compare this to the report I had saved earlier. And if there are any differences, I should probably just do a journal entry and get it cleaned up. Although, there are reasons to go back and check account by account and see what went wrong. But condenses are not perfect. It's just going to be some transactions that don't condense properly or give you errors. At the end of the day, we achieve what we wanted to achieve, which is to reduce the file size significantly. You might need to do a journal entry and clean up the balance sheet to make it match the previous number. That's just something that might come with the territory. Now I'm going to close that. I'm also going to show the profit and loss report. I'm going to do profit and loss just so you can see what happens to the P&L. So I think we went back from 1/1/2010 through 12/31/2020, and I'm going to show this by year. So now we're going to see, I'm going to collapse, and you see that some of the transactions are still there, but it's sort of kind of incomplete. Look, a lot of these costs went away, a lot of these expenses went away. Bottom line, there's some transactions that QuickBooks just will not be able to get rid of, and I'm going to show you real quick, just a quick way I can see. I'm going to go to reports, custom reports, transaction detail, and I'm going to pull that transaction or that date range that we had from before, 12/31/2019, and hit OK. And that's going to show you every single transaction that QuickBooks couldn't get rid of. Most of it are invoices with items and payments. And again, the condense is not perfect. It does keep some transactions, but I'm going to go hit Control-1 on the keyboard again and show you, yep, it cut the number of targets almost by half or a little bit, maybe 40% or so. So it did significantly reduce the file size, even though it did not get rid of all the transactions. And that's just one of those weird drawbacks that you get from doing the condense. So that's kind of the process. As I mentioned earlier, there's another type of condense. I'm going to pull it up for a second. I'm going to go to File, Utilities, Condense Data. And I don't know if you remember, on this option here, the transaction outside date range, if I do this one is going to get rid of those historical transactions, but then my balance sheet will have a problem. Now I'm just going to go ahead and go that route to just kind of show you. We're going to do the period copy, and then we're going to do 1/1/2020, and then we're going to, let's say, do 12/31/2021. We'll go a little bit in the future. And basically what I'm doing with this version of the condense is I'm truly getting rid of all those past transactions, which is much different than this traditional condense here in the top. So the period copy is going to truly get rid of that stuff. I'm going to pick a date range that also includes dates in the future, because I'm trying to do the same thing as the condense, but I'm really trying to do the period copy so it fully gets rid of those past transactions. So I'm going to click on next, and then I'm going to click on don't create summary. So that's the other key thing, because I don't want it to create any transactions on the period copy. Then I'm going to click on next, click on yes, next, begin condense, and then we're going to wait for this one. So the period copy finished. This one was a little bit faster. This one took about 20 minutes or so. One thing to point out, I should have mentioned this earlier, you can only do a period copy with QuickBooks Desktop Accountant Edition, which is a very rare edition. Most end users don't have Accountant Edition. It's the accountants that purchase specifically the Accountant Edition, one of the little perks that you have from being an accountant or for purchasing the Accountant Edition. Anyway, so we did that period copy, and then one thing that's going to be different now is I'm actually going to go pull a report and show you. All right, so let me go into the reports menu, reports, company financial, profit and loss standard. I'm going to do the same thing, go back 10 years, and kind of show you the difference here. We'll report here by year. And notice that now across the board, let me collapse the left navigation bar. Notice that there's 0 transactions. Look, absolutely 0, nothing. So this period copy does make a significant different change in dynamic when it comes to the condense, or at least compared to the condense. I'm going to hit Control-1 on the keyboard. Now notice that my QuickBooks file is 88 megabytes. That's a lot smaller than the condensed version. And the number of targets, look, 14,000 versus 200,000 or whatever it was. Look at the number of names, look at the number of customers. Obviously, that period copy is the optimal way of doing a really, really big, deep condense. The problem is, or the caveat is, I'm going to now run a balance sheet, okay? So I'm going to run a balance sheet for 12/31/2019, and there's absolutely nothing. And if you remember from the previous exercise, we still had a balance sheet when we did a regular condense. With a period copy, you don't get a balance sheet at all. So we have to go back to the original balance sheet. We're going to have to do journal entries, enter all those balance sheets. We have to load inventory beginning balances by itself, customer balances by itself, vendor balances by itself. It's going to be its own import. I mentioned earlier an article that I wrote where I talk about this, the file condense, and I walk you kind of step by step, all the steps that you have to take after you do a period copy. So I walk you, it's basically like a pretty good checklist of what if you were to do a period copy, what would that look like? Now the period copy, I do also to try to correct file errors and file corruption. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes the file corruption and file error, it's there and it will never go away. But if you got 10 years worth of data and your QuickBooks file is corrupted, and the corrupted transactions are 2, 3, 4 years ago, and you're making a period copy or a condense in which you're only keeping the last couple of years, there's a probability you could get rid of, clean up that level of corruption, but it's not always a direct correlation doing a condense and fixing corruption. Sometimes it's two entirely different things. Anyway, hope you like this video, and I'll see you on the next one.